The mansion on Hillcrest Drive had been silent for 3 years. Its grand windows shuttered against the world, its iron gates locked tight against hope itself. Behind those walls lived Margaret Whitmore, a woman who had once been the heart of the community, now reduced to a ghost haunting her own memories. She had lost everything that mattered. Her husband Thomas to a sudden heart attack, her only son Daniel to a car accident just 6 months later, and in her grief, she had built walls thicker than the stone that surrounded her estate. The servants came and went through the back entrance, instructed never to speak unless spoken to. The mail piled up unopened. The phone rang into emptiness. Margaret had decided that a world cruel enough to take everything from her deserved nothing from her in return. She would live out her days in the tomb of her former happiness, surrounded by photographs and silence, waiting for death to reunite her with those she had lost. Sar, if you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, if you believe that even the most broken hearts can find light again, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that hope can come from the most unexpected places. Your support means everything to us. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when the knocking began. Margaret sat in her library, the same leather chair where Thomas used to read the newspaper, the same weak autumn light filtering through the heavy curtains. The knocking was soft at first, almost apologetic, but persistent. She ignored it, as she had ignored every delivery person, every concerned neighbor, every well-meaning soul who had tried to reach her over the years. But this knocking was different somehow. It didn't stop. It didn't grow impatient or angry. It simply continued, a gentle rhythm that seemed to say, I know you're in there. I know you're hurting, and I'm not leaving. After 20 minutes, something inside Margaret stirred. Perhaps irritation, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the faintest whisper of her former self reminding her that she was still, technically alive. She rose from her chair, her joints stiff from hours of stillness, and made her way through the vast, dust-covered halls to the front entrance. Through the frosted glass of the door's side panel, she could make out a small figure, a child no more than 10 or 11 years old, wearing clothes that had seen better seasons, his thin jacket inadequate for the autumn chill. When she finally opened the door, ready to send him away with whatever harsh words would make him leave fastest, she found herself looking into eyes that held something she hadn't seen in 3 years, eyes that reflected pain as deep as her own. The boy was small for his age, with dark hair that needed cutting and cheeks that needed more meals. But it was his hands that stopped her from speaking. He was holding a small, battered shoebox, and those hands were trembling not from the cold, but from something that looked like fear mixed with desperate hope. The boy's name was Lucas, and he didn't ask for money. He didn't try to sell her anything. Instead, with a voice that cracked with emotion, he told her a story that shattered the careful numbness she had cultivated. His mother was sick, so sick that the hospital had sent her home because there was nothing more they could do. Cancer, he said, the word falling from his young lips like a stone into still water. They had no family, no insurance, no way to pay for the medications that might give her a few more months. His mother had been a house cleaner before she got sick, and years ago she had worked in this very mansion. She had spoken often about Mrs. Whitmore, about her kindness, her generosity, the way she had treated the staff like family. In her final days, his mother had sent him here with one request: could Mrs. Whitmore look at the contents of the shoebox? Margaret's first instinct was to refuse to close the door on this intrusion of real pain into her carefully maintained cocoon of private suffering. But something about the boy's trembling hands, about the way he stood there with such dignity despite his obvious poverty and fear, made her hesitate. She took the shoebox, noting how light it was, how worn the cardboard had become. The boy didn't move, didn't ask to come in, just stood there in the cold watching her with those unbearably knowing eyes. Inside the box were photographs. Old photographs that Margaret recognized immediately because she had taken most of them herself. There was one of her staff Christmas party from 7 years ago, everyone laughing around the decorated tree in the grand hall. Another of the company picnic Thomas had organized, children running through sprinklers while parents shared food and stories. And there, in the center of so many of these photographs, was a younger version of this boy's mother, Maria. Margaret remembered suddenly. Her name was Maria, smiling, vibrant, alive. But it was the last item in the box that broke something open inside Margaret's chest. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand, clearly composed during moments of strength between waves of illness. The letter was simple but devastating. Maria wrote about how working for the Whitmores had been the best years of her life, how Mrs. Whitmore had helped her when Lucas was born, paying for the hospital bills that Maria couldn't afford, never asking for repayment, treating it as a gift between friends. She wrote about how Mrs. Whitmore had given her hope when she had none, had shown her that kindness existed in a harsh world. And now, dying and desperate, Maria wasn't asking for money or help. She was asking Margaret to remember who she used to be, to remember that she had once believed in goodness, in helping others, in living a life that mattered beyond the walls of grief. Maria's final words were simple. Please don't let your beautiful heart die with your loved ones. The world needs it. My Lucas needs it. And I think you need it too. Margaret looked up from the letter to find Lucas still standing there, not in expectation but in patience, and suddenly she saw not just this boy but every person she had shut out, every opportunity for connection she had refused, every day she had wasted existing instead of living. Her hands were shaking now, matching the trembling in the boy's. For 3 years she had told herself that her pain was unique, that no one could understand the depth of her loss, that shutting out the world was the only way to survive. But here was this child who was about to lose his mother, who was facing poverty and loneliness, and instead of bitterness he carried photographs of happy memories. Instead of anger he carried hope. What happened next would later seem like a blur to Margaret, a breaking of a dam that released 3 years of frozen grief into flowing tears and action. She invited Lucas inside, fed him the first decent meal he'd had in weeks, listened to his stories about his mother, and heard in his voice the same love and loss that had paralyzed her. But she also heard something she had forgotten existed: resilience. This boy got up every morning, went to school, took care of his dying mother, and still believed enough in human goodness to knock on a stranger's door with nothing but a box of photographs. Margaret made phone calls that afternoon, the first she had made in years. She contacted doctors, specialists, and yes, she used her considerable wealth to ensure that Maria received the best possible care. The prognosis didn't change. Cancer was cancer, but Maria's final months were spent in comfort rather than agony, with her son beside her instead of working multiple odd jobs to afford her medications. But more than the money, Margaret gave her time. She visited Maria, sat with her, held her hand as she once had held Thomas's hand, and listened to her stories. She got to know Lucas, this remarkable boy who loved comic books and mathematics, who dreamed of becoming a doctor so he could help people the way others were helping his mother. When Maria passed 4 months later, it was peaceful and surrounded by love. Lucas cried in Margaret's arms, and as she held this grieving child, Margaret felt her own grief transform. It didn't disappear. Grief never truly does, but it became something she could carry rather than something that carried her. She realized that Thomas and Daniel wouldn't have wanted her to lock herself away. They would have wanted her to live, to love, to use her resources and her heart to make the world less painful for others. If this story has touched your heart, if it reminded you that pain can become purpose and grief can become grace, please like this video and leave a comment. Tell us about a time when kindness changed your life, or when you found hope in an unexpected place. And before we finish, I want to ask you something special. Type "Hope Lives" in the comments if you believe that it's never too late to open your heart again. Then Margaret became Lucas's guardian, and Hillcrest Manor came alive again with the sound of a child's laughter, with homework spread across the dining table, with windows thrown open to let in light and life. She established a foundation in her husband and son's names, dedicated to helping families facing medical crises they couldn't afford. She hired people who needed second chances, opened her doors to community events, and discovered that serving others didn't diminish her grief, but gave it meaning. Years later, when Lucas graduated from medical school, the first doctor in his family, funded by the woman who had once refused to open her door, he gave a speech that brought tears to everyone present. He spoke about his mother's love, about Mrs. Whitmore's transformation, about how a simple shoebox of photographs had saved 2 lives, his own, and the woman who had answered the door. He spoke about how the greatest gifts we can give aren't always the ones that cost money, but the ones that cost us our walls, our defenses, our willingness to let the world hurt us again by letting it matter again. Margaret sat in the audience, older now but no longer haunted, and she thought about that October afternoon when persistent knocking had broken through her self-imposed exile. She thought about Maria's letter, about Lucas's trembling hands, about the moment she chose connection over isolation. And she understood finally that Thomas and Daniel lived on not in her grief but in her actions, not in her memories but in her impact on others, not in the silence of a closed mansion but in the laughter and life that now filled every room. The wealthy widow had refused all visitors because she thought she had nothing left to give and nothing left to live for. But a poor boy with a shoebox of photographs had shown her the truth, that even the most broken hearts still beat, still have capacity for love, still have purpose. And sometimes, the greatest treasure we can offer someone isn't what we bring to their door, but what we help them remember they still carry inside themselves. The courage to open it.